In a world where discrimination often goes unnoticed, one incident at a seemingly ordinary airport would spark a national conversation and bring about transformative change. Shaquille, a renowned professional basketball player at the peak of his career, steps into the private aviation section of Maplewood International Airport, expecting nothing more than a routine security check before catching a flight to an important meeting in Boston. However, what starts as a typical morning quickly escalates into an unforgettable confrontation with an airport security guard, Ethan Rogers, whose unwarranted actions toward Shaquille set in motion a chain of events that would challenge the very foundations of prejudice and bias within airport security systems. What was once a moment of unjust treatment turned into a powerful movement for equality, as Shaquille's calm professionalism under immense pressure ignited a nationwide conversation about discrimination. As the video of the incident went viral, Shaquille's composed demeanor and unwavering resolve became an inspiration, not only for athletes but for anyone who has ever felt marginalized or mistreated. This is more than just a story about a famous celebrity. It's about how standing up for what's right can inspire change and create hope for others who face discrimination daily. Shaquille's journey and the incident at the airport. It was a bright Tuesday morning when Shaquille, a well-established and top-ranking basketball player, drove his sleek black Mercedes towards Maplewood International Airport's private aviation section. The sun was shining brightly, casting a golden hue over the polished surface of his car, and the air was filled with the fresh scent of spring. As he approached the exclusive VIP parking lot, Shaquille was at ease. At 30 years old, he had already established himself as one of the best in his field, a professional athlete with endorsement deals, brand collaborations, and sponsorships. His life, although demanding, was relatively routine: practice, games, travel, and meetings. Today, however, was different. Today was about an important endorsement deal with a major team in Boston, and the company had arranged for a private jet to take him to the city for an urgent meeting. Shaquille pulled his car into the VIP parking area with ease, a slight smile on his face as he thought about the opportunity ahead. The parking lot, which was less crowded than the main terminal, had a clean, exclusive feel. Several luxury vehicles were parked nearby, and the occasional whisper of businessmen and women, mostly in sharp suits, filled the air. The private terminal was quiet and serene compared to the chaos of the main airport, and it gave Shaquille the peace of mind he needed before his flight. As he stepped out of the car, he was reminded once again of how far he had come, both in his career and in life. He checked his watch, 8:30 a.m., giving him plenty of time to go through the security checks and board his private jet by 9 a.m. His flight was timely, and he wanted everything to go smoothly. He looked at himself in the rearview mirror, adjusting his dark suit jacket to make sure it fit perfectly. His signature short haircut was intact, adding a professional yet athletic touch to his overall appearance. Shaquille always believed in looking sharp, not because he needed to prove something to anyone, but because it was a reflection of his hard work, dedication, and discipline. He had worked tirelessly to reach this level of success, and looking his best was an essential part of maintaining that image. Shaquille took a deep breath and grabbed his leather duffel bag, filled with important documents, personal items, and necessities. Over his left shoulder, he swung a designer backpack, which contained his passport, flight details, and a few other essentials. His sneakers squeaked slightly against the smooth pavement as he walked with a confident stride toward the terminal entrance. Every step felt deliberate. Every move was calculated. He was prepared for the meeting ahead and ready to take on whatever challenges came his way. The private aviation terminal at Maplewood International was different from the chaos of the main terminal. It was quieter, more elegant, with sleek, modern architecture and expansive glass windows that offered views of the tarmac and runway. Shaquille could see the ground crew prepping his jet for takeoff in the distance. There was something calming about the whole scene. It wasn't just the luxury and exclusivity of the space, but the knowledge that this was a part of his routine, a place where he had been countless times before. As he neared the entrance, Shaquille noticed the security guard standing at his post. The man, Ethan Rogers, was a middle-aged individual with graying hair, dressed in a blue uniform, with a badge clearly identifying him as a member of the airport security team. At first, Shaquille didn't think much of it. He had passed through many security checkpoints in his life as a professional athlete. He had dealt with security at airports, hotels, and stadiums across the country, so this was just another minor procedure before his flight. However, little did he know that this encounter would be anything but ordinary. Shaquille, always prepared for any situation, had already pulled out his identification, travel documents, and credentials as he walked toward the entrance. He knew that being prepared would make the process smoother. Holding his player credentials, driver's license, and flight details in his hand, he walked confidently toward the security checkpoint. The morning was serene. Birds chirped in the trees near the parking lot, and the soft breeze made the air feel fresh and clean. The soft hum of airplanes taking off in the distance added to the peaceful atmosphere of the private terminal. It felt like just another normal day in his busy life. Shaquille was focused on the meeting ahead and the opportunity that awaited him in Boston. As he reached the terminal entrance, he noticed that this section of the airport was much quieter than the main terminal. A few business passengers walked by, dressed in sharp suits and carrying designer bags. It felt like a secluded part of the airport where privacy was valued and where celebrities like him were often seen. The atmosphere was one of exclusivity, and Shaquille found himself appreciating the tranquility it offered. He could see his chartered jet waiting on the tarmac, ready for departure. His mind wandered for a moment as he thought about the significance of the meeting. This deal could play a crucial role in securing his future with the Boston team. It was an important step, and Shaquille was eager to take advantage of the opportunity. Just before reaching the door, Shaquille sent a quick text to his assistant back at the stadium, confirming that his afternoon appointments had been rescheduled. He liked keeping everything organized, ensuring that no detail was overlooked. This level of organization was a key reason why he had become one of the most respected and successful players in the league. Everything in his life was scheduled, planned, and executed with precision. At that moment, the automatic doors of the terminal slid open before him, and Shaquille was just a few steps away from stepping inside when an unexpected turn of events would unfold, completely changing the course of his day. Shaquille had no idea that his seemingly ordinary morning was about to take a dramatic and unforgettable turn. The tension grows. As Shaquille reached the automatic doors, his eyes were already scanning the interior of the terminal. Everything seemed to be running smoothly. A few passengers were scattered around the terminal, most of them engaged in quiet conversations or typing away on their laptops. The atmosphere was calm, professional, and quiet, exactly what Shaquille had come to expect from the private aviation area. The distant sounds of airplanes taking off and landing from the main terminal were a reminder that business was running as usual. However, in a few moments, everything was about to change. Security guard Ethan Rogers, standing just a few feet away from the entrance, seemed to be waiting for Shaquille's arrival. Shaquille hadn't paid much attention to him at first. He had been through so many security checks in his life that it had become second nature. What he hadn't expected was that Rogers would single him out in a way that seemed entirely unnecessary. Shaquille continued his calm stride toward the entrance, holding out his documents in his hand, prepared to go through the usual procedure. However, as Shaquille got closer, Rogers shifted his stance. The change was subtle but noticeable. He moved from a casual posture to one that was more rigid, almost confrontational. There was an immediate shift in the air around them, and Shaquille instinctively knew that something wasn't right. His thoughts raced for a moment as he wondered if there was a mistake in the system or some kind of routine check that needed to be addressed. But the moment Rogers raised his hand in a clear stopping motion, Shaquille's calm demeanor was tested. The security guard had stepped directly in front of him, blocking his way. "Excuse me, sir," Rogers said loudly, his voice carrying across the quiet terminal. "You need to head to the main terminal. This is a private aviation area." Rogers didn't even glance at the documents that Shaquille was holding out. His tone was firm, dismissive, and completely unnecessary. The calm that Shaquille had felt moments ago began to crack, but he remained composed. He had faced discrimination before, but it was always jarring when it happened. This was no different. Shaquille, his voice steady and professional, replied, "Good morning, sir. I have my documentation right here. I'm scheduled for the 9 a.m. flight to Boston." He stepped forward, attempting to hand Rogers the papers, hoping that it would clear up the misunderstanding. But Rogers, almost without hesitation, took a step back, avoiding any direct interaction with Shaquille's documents. Instead, he crossed his arms and raised an eyebrow as if questioning Shaquille's right to be there. The simple act of showing the documents that were clearly in order was being completely ignored, and Shaquille felt his patience beginning to wear thin. "I've been working here for 15 years, Rogers said with a sense of authority that came across as dismissive rather than respectful. "I know who belongs here and who doesn't." He looked Shaquille up and down, his eyes scanning Shaquille's designer suit and expensive sneakers with obvious skepticism. It was clear that Rogers had already made up his mind about Shaquille, despite the fact that the documentation in his hands proved his legitimacy. The irritation on Shaquille's face was now evident, but he chose to remain calm. Years of training on the basketball court had taught him how to deal with pressure. He knew that reacting rashly wouldn't help the situation. From the corner of his eye, Shaquille noticed a few other passengers passing by the entrance. 2 businessmen walked right past Rogers without any issue, and Rogers didn't even glance at their credentials. Shaquille observed this carefully, noting how Rogers had let them pass without question. The disparity in treatment was undeniable, and the realization made the situation even more frustrating. Was it because of his appearance? Was it because he was a black athlete dressed in expensive clothing? Shaquille wasn't sure, but he knew something was wrong. Taking a deep breath, Shaquille remained composed and asked, "Sir, I understand you're doing your job, but I am a professional athlete, and I'm flying to Boston for an important meeting. Here are my credentials, flight documentation, and ID." He repeated the offer to show his documents, but Rogers didn't even acknowledge them. Instead, he let out a short, harsh laugh. The sound was biting, almost mocking, and it caught the attention of a few bystanders. A wave of discomfort spread through the small crowd that had started to gather. Shaquille could sense that others were beginning to notice the injustice unfolding in front of them. Rogers, growing increasingly dismissive and confrontational, said, "Right, and I'm the President of the United States. I'm trying to be nice here, but you need to leave. The main terminal is that way," he pointed down the hall, far away from the private terminal entrance, indicating that Shaquille would have to walk all the way back to the regular airport entrance. A small group of bystanders whispered among themselves, and some of them even pulled out their phones, likely to document the interaction. Shaquille noticed this, but he stayed calm. The last thing he wanted was to escalate the situation unnecessarily. He had seen how these things could get out of hand in an instant, and he didn't want to be part of that. "Mr. Rogers," Shaquille said quietly, addressing the guard by name as he read the name tag on Rogers' chest. "I'm going to ask one more time. Please check my documentation. My meeting in Boston is time-sensitive, and this delay is unnecessary." Shaquille's voice was still calm, but there was a firmness to it now. His pulse was rising, and his frustration was palpable, but he refused to let it show. Rogers, now visibly irritated, snapped back, "You're telling me how to do my job?" He grabbed for his radio, making a big show of it as if he were preparing to escalate the situation further. Shaquille remained steadfast, still holding his phone and recording everything. This wasn't just a matter of standing his ground. This was about ensuring that his dignity wasn't stripped away in front of others. Just as the situation continued to escalate, another couple approached the entrance. They were casually dressed, carrying expensive golf bags. Shaquille watched as Rogers' entire demeanor shifted instantly. He smiled broadly and moved quickly to open the door for them, greeting them warmly. The contrast in his behavior was stark. He had just moments ago been confrontational with Shaquille, but now, with these white passengers, his tone and behavior were completely different. Shaquille, still recording, couldn't believe what he was witnessing. The growing crowd around them began to murmur in disbelief, and Shaquille, who had been holding back, spoke up. "So, you'll let them through without checking their documents, but you won't even look at mine?" His voice was quiet but firm. The injustice was becoming increasingly apparent, and Shaquille had had enough. Rogers' face flushed bright red with anger, and he shot back, "Are you accusing me of something?" As the tension mounted, Shaquille held his ground, repeating that he was only asking for a fair check of his documents. The situation was now attracting more attention, and the air felt thick with the frustration of the crowd. It wasn't just Shaquille who was being treated unfairly now, it was everyone watching the scene unfold. Public reaction and media coverage. As the tension in the terminal escalated, the atmosphere shifted from one of mild confusion to one of palpable unease. Shaquille, despite his composed demeanor, couldn't ignore the feeling of being singled out. The confrontation was now undeniable. It wasn't just a disagreement between a security guard and a passenger, it had become an event. The crowd surrounding them grew larger as more and more people began to take notice of the altercation. People who had been casually waiting for their flights or going about their business were now openly filming the scene, their smartphones raised in the air, capturing every moment of the growing confrontation. What had started as a simple security check was transforming into something far more significant, an event that was being broadcast in real time to the world. The teenage girl who had been standing near the entrance had begun live streaming the entire exchange. Her phone screen flickered as she panned back and forth, capturing the back and forth between Shaquille and Rogers. The girl's voice was steady, and her determination to capture the injustice unfolding before her was evident. She knew this was no ordinary confrontation. This was a moment that could change everything. "This is going viral already," she said, her words resonating throughout the growing crowd. "Over 1,000 people are watching right now." The number of viewers surged, and in just moments, the incident was being shared across social media platforms at an alarming rate. People across the country, and even the world, were tuning in to witness what was happening in real time. Shaquille, though fully aware of the attention he was now receiving, remained remarkably calm. His years of experience in front of cameras and on the basketball court had taught him how to stay level-headed in tense situations. He knew the world was watching, and that knowledge only added pressure. But Shaquille was a professional, and professionals stay composed under scrutiny. Even though his heart was racing and his frustration was growing, he did not allow his emotions to overtake him. He stood firm, resolute in his belief that he had every right to be where he was, and every right to have his documents checked fairly and without prejudice. As the live stream continued, the reactions from online viewers started flooding in. Social media exploded with support for Shaquille. Hashtags like #JusticeForShaquille and #StandUpAgainstDiscrimination began trending, and the incident quickly caught the attention of major news outlets. As the minutes passed, the world's eyes turned to Maplewood International Airport. On Twitter, people shared their own stories of discrimination, and many began to question how often these types of incidents occurred unnoticed. Videos of Shaquille standing his ground against Rogers, calmly asking for fairness and respect, were being reshared by thousands. The more people saw, the more they recognized the unjust treatment that Shaquille was enduring. Inside the terminal, the atmosphere was charged. People who had witnessed the altercation whispered among themselves, exchanging looks of disbelief. Many were visibly uncomfortable with how Rogers was handling the situation. A flight attendant from another private jet, who had been watching the incident unfold, shook her head in disapproval. "This isn't right," she said aloud, her voice laced with frustration. "He's just trying to show his documents." Her words echoed through the terminal, and several others in the crowd nodded in agreement. It was clear that Rogers' actions were not just disrespectful, they were wrong. More people began to speak up, voicing their discomfort with what was happening. An older man, who was dressed in a pilot's uniform, stepped forward from the crowd. "I've seen Shaquille on TV," he said, pointing toward the basketball player. "He's actually a famous basketball player." The man's words were meant to highlight the absurdity of the situation, but Rogers waved him off angrily, dismissing his comments. "Everyone needs to mind their own business," Rogers barked, his face flushed with anger. His outburst only served to escalate the situation further, and the crowd's disapproval of his behavior grew louder. It was no longer just Shaquille against Rogers. It was a community of onlookers rallying against an unjust system. The tension was palpable as Rogers' aggression continued to rise. He reached for his radio, making a show of calling for backup, but it was clear that this situation was spiraling out of control. The people watching couldn't believe what they were seeing. What was supposed to be a simple procedure had now turned into an all-out confrontation between a security guard and a professional athlete, with racial undertones that were becoming impossible to ignore. Rogers' refusal to check Shaquille's documents and the way he had treated him, compared to how he had let the other passengers pass freely, was too obvious to ignore. The entire situation was charged with racial tension, and it was evident to everyone watching. As the crowd grew larger, more people spoke up, voicing their support for Shaquille. A young woman, who had been standing at the back of the crowd, called out, "This isn't fair. He's shown you everything you asked for." Her voice was firm, and she, like many others, had clearly had enough of Rogers' behavior. The public outcry was growing, and the situation was quickly turning from an internal dispute to a public spectacle. More and more people were becoming involved, either by supporting Shaquille or by questioning Rogers' actions. It was clear that the onlookers were no longer passive bystanders. They were now participants in a larger conversation about fairness, equality, and respect. At this point, the situation had escalated to a point where it was no longer just about Shaquille and the security guard. It was about the thousands, perhaps millions, of people who had faced similar forms of discrimination in airports, offices, and other public spaces. People who had been treated unfairly, who had been judged based on their appearance or ethnicity, and who had felt powerless to speak up. Shaquille's quiet resistance was becoming a symbol of defiance against this kind of prejudice. And the growing crowd of witnesses was helping to amplify his message, turning a personal injustice into a larger social movement. As the tension peaked, the head of airport security, Mrs. Stevens, entered the terminal, accompanied by a representative from Shaquille's charter company. The arrival of these higher-ups signaled that the situation was about to take a significant turn. Shaquille's calm demeanor had helped de-escalate the confrontation to a degree, but now, the proper authorities were stepping in to correct the situation. They understood that the eyes of the world were on them, and the stakes were higher than ever. Meanwhile, outside the terminal, the news vans had arrived, their bright satellite dishes spinning into place as reporters and cameramen set up for live broadcasts. The video had already gone viral, and news outlets were scrambling to cover the story. Local channels and even national networks like CNN were reporting on the incident, providing live updates. As the news coverage spread, the conversation shifted from a specific airport incident to a broader societal issue. The spotlight was now on Maplewood International Airport, and the world was waiting to see how the situation would be handled. The viral nature of the event had turned the airport into the epicenter of a larger discussion about race, discrimination, and institutional bias. What had started as a minor inconvenience for Shaquille had now snowballed into a global conversation, drawing attention to the pervasive issues of inequality that existed in many public and private spaces. It wasn't just about one man's unfair treatment anymore. It was about challenging a system that had allowed such discrimination to continue unchecked. Security's intervention and consequences. As the tension in the terminal continued to build, the scene became increasingly chaotic. Shaquille stood his ground, holding his documents in one hand and his phone in the other, recording every moment of the confrontation with Rogers. The crowd that had gathered around them grew larger, and whispers of disbelief filled the air. More and more people were pulling out their phones to document what was happening, and the situation was quickly reaching a boiling point. The entire airport seemed to be holding its breath, waiting to see how this conflict would resolve itself. Shaquille, who had maintained his calm professionalism throughout the ordeal, was now facing the very real possibility that this would escalate beyond the terminal. He had tried to resolve the situation quietly and respectfully, presenting his documents and making reasonable requests. But Rogers, his behavior becoming more erratic with each passing minute, refused to acknowledge Shaquille's credentials and continued to escalate the confrontation. The moment was now larger than either of them. It had become a national story, a symbol of racial injustice, and an example of the biases that pervaded airport security systems across the country. Just as things were about to reach a breaking point, the head of airport security, Mrs. Stevens, arrived on the scene. Mrs. Stevens was a tall woman in her 50s, wearing a crisp black suit that signified her authority. She walked quickly and purposefully toward the growing crowd, accompanied by a representative from the charter company, Mr. Robert Davis, and the terminal's general manager, Mr. Alan Roberts. As soon as they entered the terminal, the crowd fell silent. The authority of the three new arrivals was palpable. They knew exactly what was at stake, and they could see the chaos that had unfolded in real time on the video feeds from the cameras. The message was clear. This was not just a minor disagreement anymore. This was an incident that needed to be addressed at the highest level. Mrs. Stevens cleared her throat, her voice sharp and commanding as she addressed Rogers directly. "Mr. Rogers," she said, her tone unwavering. "Step away from Shaquille immediately." The force of her command caused Rogers to turn around quickly. His face, which had been flushed with anger, turned pale as he realized the gravity of the situation. His hands shook as he fumbled for words. "I was just following protocols," Rogers stammered, his voice trailing off as he realized that his actions were indefensible. It was clear to everyone present that Rogers was struggling to justify his behavior, and the evidence was overwhelming. He had failed to follow any reasonable protocol. His actions were not about security, they were about bias. Shaquille, who had remained calm throughout the ordeal, felt a sense of relief wash over him as he saw Mrs. Stevens step in. He had known that the truth was on his side, but it was evident that things had gone too far. The delay, the unnecessary confrontation, and the aggressive treatment had caused a ripple effect. It was no longer just about Shaquille. It was about the wider systemic issue of racial discrimination in airport security. The behavior of one individual had shone a light on a much larger problem that needed to be addressed. As Mrs. Stevens moved toward Shaquille, she spoke directly to him. "Shaquille, I am so sorry about this incident," she said, her voice sincere. "This is completely unacceptable. We've been working with you for years, and this should not have happened." She quickly took the documents from Shaquille's hand, reviewing them with a professional, swift efficiency. "Everything is in perfect order," she announced. "Exactly as we would expect from one of our regular private charter passengers." Her words were reassuring, but Shaquille couldn't help but feel a sense of frustration that this situation had even occurred. The fact that he had been delayed for so long, despite providing everything he needed to board his flight, was infuriating. But he was determined to not let the experience define him. It was clear that his calmness in the face of adversity had been a pivotal factor in bringing attention to the situation. Mrs. Stevens then turned to Rogers, who was still standing in a daze, his face a mixture of confusion and anger. "Would you like to explain why you refused to even look at these documents?" she asked, her voice sharp with disapproval. Rogers, now visibly sweating, opened his mouth to speak, but the words seemed to escape him. His mind was racing, but he knew he had no reasonable excuse. I was just following the rules," he mumbled, his voice weak. But it was clear that his rationale didn't hold up. The evidence against him was irrefutable. His own actions, as captured on the security cameras, showed a clear pattern of discrimination. He had allowed multiple passengers, who had not been questioned, to pass through without any issue. But when Shaquille, a black athlete, attempted to board his flight, he was subjected to unnecessary scrutiny. Rogers had made the decision to treat Shaquille differently, and that decision had cost him his job. The crowd, which had been quietly observing the scene, began to murmur in agreement with Mrs. Stevens' actions. A young woman, who had been one of the onlookers, spoke out, "This is disgraceful. He's shown you everything you asked for. What more do you want from him?" Her words rang out with clarity, and the sentiment was echoed by others in the crowd. It was clear that people were fed up with the kind of treatment that Shaquille had been subjected to, and they were vocal about it. As the situation continued to unfold, Mr. Davis, the representative from the charter company, moved quickly to Shaquille's side. He extended a hand, apologizing profusely. "Shaquille, I'm so sorry," he said. "This should never have happened. We've worked with you for years, and this is completely unacceptable." He quickly pulled out his tablet and began showing Mrs. Stevens the history of Shaquille's flight details. Everything was in order, as expected, but now the situation had become a matter of public accountability. Mr. Davis's actions reflected the charter company's recognition that their client had been wronged. He was already working to rectify the situation, assuring Shaquille that this would never happen again. Meanwhile, Mr. Roberts, the terminal manager, turned to Rogers. His voice was firm as he gave Rogers an ultimatum. "Hand over your security badge right now," he ordered. Rogers, his face flushed with embarrassment, fumbled with his badge, his hands shaking as he removed it from his chest. The process was slow, but the action was symbolic. Rogers was being stripped of his power in the face of overwhelming evidence of his misconduct. He had overstepped his authority, and now the consequences were clear. With Rogers' badge in hand, Mr. Roberts and Mrs. Stevens escorted him away from the scene, as the crowd parted to let them through. Shaquille stood silently, still holding his phone, recording the aftermath of the confrontation. It was over. The immediate crisis had been resolved. But the implications of the incident were far from finished. Shaquille's impact on the system. As the airport security incident unfolded and resolved, it was clear to everyone present that the confrontation had become a defining moment, not only for Shaquille but for the entire airport and its system. Shaquille had shown immense courage in the face of blatant discrimination, but what mattered most was the ripple effect his actions would have on the broader system. His calm professionalism had sparked a nationwide conversation about racial bias and unfair treatment in security procedures at airports. What had been a personal confrontation was now a societal issue that needed to be addressed, and the changes that would follow in the aftermath would be felt for years to come. Once Rogers had been escorted away, the airport management quickly sprang into action. Mrs. Stevens, the head of security, had already made it clear that this kind of behavior would not be tolerated, but the response needed to go beyond just one incident. The airport had to implement systematic changes to prevent future occurrences of such discrimination. They couldn't afford to sweep this under the rug. Mrs. Stevens and Mr. Roberts, the terminal's general manager, knew that the security policies and training programs needed a serious overhaul. The reputation of the airport was at stake, but more importantly, so was the public's trust in the system. While the immediate resolution was important, the long-term changes would be the true measure of success. In the days that followed, the airport introduced a series of reforms aimed at eliminating bias from the security process. One of the most significant changes was the implementation of body cameras for all security personnel. This would ensure that every interaction between passengers and security guards would be recorded, creating transparency in the security process. The cameras served as both a deterrent for discriminatory behavior and a tool to hold security personnel accountable for their actions. The new policy also mandated that two security officers, preferably from different backgrounds, would work together at each checkpoint to ensure fairness and impartiality. This new procedure was designed to prevent situations like the one with Shaquille from occurring again. By pairing security officers with differing backgrounds, the airport hoped to reduce the likelihood of racial profiling and ensure that security checks were carried out fairly. Additionally, signs explaining passengers' rights were put up in multiple languages throughout the terminal, making it clear that everyone, regardless of their race, appearance, or background, had the right to fair treatment. These signs not only served as a reminder to security personnel, but also empowered passengers to speak up if they felt they were being treated unfairly. This was just one part of a broader initiative to educate both staff and passengers about their rights and responsibilities within the airport system. Shaquille, who had endured the brunt of this discriminatory treatment, became the face of this new wave of change. His quiet resilience and ability to maintain professionalism in the face of such blatant prejudice inspired countless others. The news of his encounter spread far and wide, but the message was clear: standing up for what's right can change the system. His actions had ignited a fire for reform that reached beyond the walls of Maplewood International Airport and touched airports across the nation. At the heart of these changes was Shaquille's determination not to let this incident define him, but to use it as a platform for a larger movement. He knew that the work was just beginning. The changes at Maplewood Airport were a start, but there was still so much to be done. He became an active participant in the development of the new policies, working closely with Mrs. Stevens, Mr. Davis, and other key players to ensure that the new security protocols were both effective and fair. He made sure that the voices of those who had been affected by discrimination were heard loud and clear. Shaquille was not just fighting for himself. He was fighting for everyone who had ever been unfairly targeted or treated with bias. As part of his involvement in the reform process, Shaquille took time to meet with local communities and organizations. He used his platform to speak out about the systemic issues that existed within private aviation security and beyond. He met with civil rights groups, attorneys, and advocacy organizations to discuss how to better address issues of racial bias and how to ensure that future generations of passengers would not have to face the same kind of treatment he had experienced. Shaquille's story had become a rallying cry for those who had been silenced for too long. The influence of his actions was also seen in the corporate world. The charter company that had been responsible for Shaquille's flight quickly adopted new policies to prevent such incidents from happening again. They created a new VIP passenger app that allowed for quicker, more streamlined check-ins, with enhanced security clearance and digital IDs for all passengers. The goal was to remove the opportunity for security guards to judge passengers based on their appearance or background. In just 1 week, the company reported that bookings from minority executives had increased by 50%. This demonstrated that when companies take a stand for fairness and equality, they can also reap the benefits in terms of customer loyalty and trust. Shaquille's story began to take on a life of its own. The hashtag Justice for Shaquille was trending on social media, with thousands of people sharing their own experiences of discrimination and bias. The story was being discussed not just in the media but in classrooms, boardrooms, and living rooms across the country. People from all walks of life were joining the conversation, demanding change and calling for accountability. In many ways, Shaquille had become a symbol for the fight against discrimination, not just in aviation but in all industries. His ability to remain calm and composed, even in the face of injustice, was a lesson for everyone. It was possible to challenge a broken system without resorting to anger or violence. Meanwhile, the teenage girl who had live-streamed the incident, Jenny Martinez, became an activist in her own right. Her bravery in recording the event and her decision to share it with the world had made her a household name. Jenny went on to create an organization called Record for Rights, which encouraged people to safely document incidents of discrimination in public spaces. Her organization gained traction quickly, with civil rights groups offering their support and partnering with her to expand the movement. The impact of Shaquille's actions went beyond the airport. News outlets began to cover the systemic issues of racial bias in security protocols, not just at airports but in other industries as well. The public's awareness of these issues grew, and more people began to demand accountability from businesses, institutions, and governments. Shaquille's stand against discrimination had ignited a broader cultural shift, one that called for fairness, equality, and respect for all people, regardless of their race or background. National attention and empowerment. As the story of Shaquille's encounter with security guard Ethan Rogers spread across the media and social platforms, the magnitude of what had happened began to crystallize. What had started as an isolated incident at a single airport soon became a symbol for the fight against systemic discrimination. The video of Shaquille remaining calm and composed in the face of unnecessary scrutiny and bias had sparked a national conversation about how racial prejudice still existed in many sectors of society, particularly in institutions like airport security. What made this story resonate so strongly was not just the celebrity of Shaquille, but the courage he showed in standing up to an unjust system, while remaining professional and focused on the bigger picture. News outlets across the country picked up the story, and soon, it was being discussed in homes, workplaces, and schools. What had been an embarrassing moment for one security guard became a turning point for millions of others who had dealt with similar prejudices. As more people saw the footage of Shaquille's interaction with Rogers, the message was clear. Standing up against injustice wasn't just about fighting back, it was about standing firm in the face of adversity while maintaining one's dignity. Shaquille's behavior had set an example for anyone who felt powerless in the face of discrimination. Within days, the hashtag #JusticeForShaquille trended on social media, with people from all walks of life sharing their own experiences of discrimination, particularly in the context of travel and security. Shaquille's experience had struck a chord with so many who had experienced unfair treatment in similar settings. It became clear that Shaquille's stand wasn't just an isolated story of one celebrity, it was the beginning of a movement. Shaquille had shown that ordinary people, not just famous athletes, could be catalysts for change. His composed response had elevated him from just another sports star to a powerful symbol of resistance against bias and inequality. The impact of Shaquille's actions stretched far beyond social media. Civil rights organizations, many of whom had been advocating for systemic change in various institutions, quickly lent their support to the issue. They organized rallies, protests, and online campaigns, all focused on airport security protocols, racial bias in the workforce, and the urgent need for reform. Shaquille's calm demeanor in the midst of the tension had given people a new tool, the ability to confront injustice without resorting to violence or anger. His message wasn't one of confrontation but one of dignity, self-respect, and a call for reform. Shaquille's influence only grew stronger as news outlets from around the world began to cover the story in detail. Not only was he interviewed by major television networks, but his actions were also used as case studies for handling discrimination professionally. Universities and institutions reached out to Shaquille, asking him to speak at conferences, seminars, and panels where issues of racial bias, professional conduct, and empowerment were discussed. His story became an example of how individuals could create change, no matter their status or occupation. Behind the scenes, Shaquille used his newfound platform to push for real and lasting change. He worked closely with civil rights groups, political leaders, and legal teams to advocate for policies that would address racial bias in the aviation and travel industries. It was clear to him that, while his personal experience had been harrowing, the larger issue at hand was systemic, and it required a collective effort to address. In the months following the incident, he became a vocal advocate for reform, speaking out on issues such as the importance of diversity in the workplace and the need for more transparency in airport security procedures. The charter company that had arranged Shaquille's private flight, which had quickly acknowledged the injustice that had occurred, also underwent significant changes. They rolled out new policies that emphasized the importance of a respectful, unbiased approach to security. Their staff underwent sensitivity training, and a new app was developed for VIP passengers, which allowed for pre-approved security clearance, removing any need for subjective decision-making. The goal was to ensure that discrimination didn't have a chance to take root. The company's business improved rapidly, as the changes attracted more minority clients and corporate clients who valued the commitment to inclusivity. In addition to airport reforms, the impact of Shaquille's actions spread into the world of sports as well. Athletes, particularly those from minority backgrounds, began to take notice of how Shaquille had handled the situation. His ability to stay calm under pressure and navigate a tense, discriminatory moment with professionalism was something that young athletes could look up to. Many of them began to speak out about their own experiences with racism in the world of professional sports, whether during games, in locker rooms, or even at airports. Shaquille received messages of gratitude from athletes, coaches, and professionals alike. Many of them thanked him for showing them that it was possible to fight against discrimination without compromising one's character. They expressed admiration for his ability to face the situation with dignity while ensuring that those who discriminated against him were held accountable. In doing so, Shaquille had shown them that it wasn't just about facing down prejudice, it was about doing so in a way that empowered others to stand up for what was right. Shaquille's message also resonated with many young people who were just beginning to navigate the world of professional sports and business. He became a role model not just for how to handle adversity but also for how to use one's platform to create positive change. The young generation, in particular, responded with enthusiasm, seeing in Shaquille a mentor who was not afraid to take a stand. He was a beacon of hope for those who felt that they did not have the power to challenge unfair treatment in their own lives. Shaquille's actions also had a profound impact on other industries. In the wake of the Maplewood Airport incident, many companies began revisiting their own internal policies on discrimination. It wasn't just about public relations anymore, it was about creating actual systemic change. The Shaquille Standards, as they came to be known, became a model for organizations to follow. Several industries, from healthcare to law enforcement, sought to implement similar practices and training programs, ensuring that their employees would be better equipped to handle issues of racial bias and discrimination in the workplace. As the dust settled from the dramatic incident at Maplewood International Airport, it became evident that what had transpired that fateful morning was not just a passing moment, it was the beginning of something much bigger. Shaquille's decision to remain calm, despite the unjust treatment he had endured, had sparked a nationwide conversation that transcended the boundaries of professional sports and airport security. The changes he had ignited would have a far-reaching impact on not just the aviation industry, but on every sector that had been plagued by discrimination and prejudice. In the weeks and months that followed, Shaquille's role as a symbol for justice and fairness became more solidified. The Shaquille Standards, as they came to be known, had set a new benchmark for how industries should approach diversity, equality, and inclusion. Maplewood International Airport, once the site of a painful episode, had transformed into a model of progressive change. The implementation of body cameras, updated security protocols, and new training systems for staff were only the beginning. The airport had not only acknowledged the systemic flaws that had allowed discrimination to fester, but had taken concrete steps to ensure that such behavior would no longer be tolerated. Shaquille, however, knew that real change came with sustained effort. He continued to work closely with Mrs. Stevens, Mr. Roberts, and others to refine and expand the changes at Maplewood Airport. His involvement was crucial in ensuring that the new security procedures were implemented with the utmost care and diligence. His efforts also extended to other airports and organizations, as he traveled across the country to share his story and advocate for reform. He became a frequent speaker at conferences, addressing industry leaders and policymakers about the importance of addressing systemic bias and creating inclusive environments for all people. His advocacy extended beyond the confines of airports. Shaquille had long been passionate about creating opportunities for young athletes, particularly those from marginalized communities. He used his platform to mentor these young athletes, encouraging them to pursue their dreams while emphasizing the importance of standing up for themselves when faced with injustice. His calm response to adversity had become a cornerstone of his teachings, as he instilled in them the belief that they, too, had the power to create change in their communities. Meanwhile, the media's coverage of the incident had shifted from a sensationalized moment to a profound examination of racial bias and its consequences. News outlets, once focused on the controversy itself, now ran segments about the positive changes that were being made in airports and other institutions across the country. The coverage had helped amplify Shaquille's message, and he became a key figure in the movement to fight discrimination in all its forms. The hashtag Justice for Shaquille continued to trend, with people from all walks of life sharing their own stories of standing up against prejudice and discrimination. Shaquille's story also reached the halls of Congress. Lawmakers began to take notice of the widespread support for the changes Shaquille had helped bring about. Discussions about reforming airport security, as well as broader measures to combat systemic discrimination in various industries, gained momentum. Shaquille's advocacy for diversity training in the workplace and his insistence on the importance of creating transparent systems of accountability were central to these discussions. His work had not only inspired a cultural shift within the aviation industry, but had become a rallying cry for broader legislative action aimed at dismantling the structures that perpetuated inequality. As for Shaquille himself, his personal life had also evolved. The endorsement deals and offers of interviews that flooded in following the incident had opened new doors for him. But he remained focused on the bigger picture. While his career as a professional athlete continued to thrive, Shaquille's heart was in the fight for social justice. His role as a public figure had become about more than basketball. It was about using his influence to create a better world for those who had been mistreated and marginalized for far too long. Shaquille's efforts were not in vain. The changes he helped inspire rippled through the very fabric of society, influencing other industries and organizations to take a hard look at their own practices. The once dismissed voices of those who had been treated unfairly in airports, in the workplace, and in the streets were now being heard. Thanks to Shaquille's courage and leadership, the conversation about racial discrimination had shifted. What had been once a silent struggle was now an open dialogue, and a movement for change had begun to take root. In his own words, Shaquille had said, "Success is the best response to discrimination." But as he sat in his office, reading the hundreds of letters from people who had been inspired by his actions, he realized that the true victory lay not in the success he had achieved, but in the positive changes he had helped to bring about. The real win was the hope he had inspired in others, the hope that, through courage and determination, one person could change the world. Shaquille's legacy would continue to grow long after his time as a basketball player came to an end. His story would be told for generations, not just as a tale of overcoming adversity but as a testament to the power of standing up for what is right. Through his leadership, he had shown the world that discrimination could be defeated, not through anger or violence, but through dignity, grace, and a steadfast commitment to justice. As Shaquille sat back and reflected on the journey that had started that fateful morning at the airport, he knew that the fight was far from over. But he also knew that his actions had laid the groundwork for lasting change, a change that would continue to inspire others to take a stand and create a world where every person, regardless of their background, could walk through an airport or any institution with the respect and dignity they deserved. In this powerful story, watch as Shaquille, one of the country's top basketball players, finds himself facing an unexpected and unjust challenge at Maplewood International Airport. Stopped by security for no apparent reason, Shaquille's calm and professional response in the face of discrimination sparks a nationwide conversation about racial bias and inequality in airport security. What started as a single confrontation soon became a movement for change, as Shaquille's courage in standing up against prejudice led to significant reforms in airport security and became a beacon of hope for others who had faced similar injustices. This story isn't just about a famous celebrity, it's about how anyone, no matter their status, can stand up and make a difference. Join us as we explore how Shaquille's actions led to groundbreaking changes in security protocols, inspired millions, and brought awareness to the systemic issues of racial discrimination in airports and beyond. From the first moment of injustice to the eventual widespread reforms, this is a story of resilience, empowerment, and the ongoing fight for equality. Tags. Shaquille Basketball. Discrimination at airport. Racial bias in security. Airport discrimination. Shaquille fight for equality. Viral story of Shaquille. Change in airport security policies. Racial profiling in airports. Shaquille Maplewood Airport incident. Diversity and equality in airports. Systemic racism in security. How to fight discrimination. Shaquille stand up for justice. Airport security reform. Basketball players fighting discrimination. Social justice and equality. Famous athlete fight against bias. Maplewood Airport story. Social change through activism. Empowering discrimination stories. Video tags. Hashtag Shaquille, hashtag discrimination, hashtag equality, hashtag justice, hashtag racial bias, hashtag systemic racism, hashtag social change, hashtag airport security, hashtag diversity, hashtag activism, hashtag fight for equality, hashtag inspiration, hashtag athletes for change, hashtag fight against discrimination, hashtag change the system, hashtag viral story.